Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Happy Tuesday, August 13th, 2024. It is approximately 5:30 in the morning. I've had some adjustments done to my schedule over the next couple of weeks. We will iron those out during our next live stream, but I did promise you guys we would have an update on Tropical Storm Ernesto, so here we are. The system is currently moving its way through the Leeward Islands as we speak, and we're going to get into all the latest information, but first, please consider clicking that subscribe button, nudging that like button, and sharing this content if you find it viable for those not only in the Lesser Antilles, the U.S. British Virgin Islands, Puerto Rico, Bermuda, and it does look like a potential impact onto Atlantic Canada is a lot more reasonable. We'll talk all about that here right now. So just as we would on our live discussions, even though this is a long-form video, we're starting off on our GOES East full disc satellite shot, and I want to prime the setup here. This is Alberto. Diurnal Maximum actually did a lot of really good work for this system. It helped it out tremendously, and you can see a lot of really good wraparound moisture finally getting closer and closer to the low-level circulation. Not entirely spinning the fastest. It doesn't have a super well-organized mid and low-level circulation. It looks like there could still be some elongation in it just looking at its north to south orientation from here to here. Still somewhat on the north side loaded aspect of it with a little bit of increased thunderstorm activity affecting the Windward Islands. If you watched my brief yesterday, I'd mentioned to you that the sustained and most impactful phenomena with this system will be predominantly confined to the Leeward Islands, the central and northern half especially of our Lesser Antilles island chain. The south side is going to see some impacts, and we are seeing those sporadic showers, storms, and very high amounts of wind coming through that area, but the sustained impacts are going to remain on the north side of this system as it rapidly moves off towards the west. It has slowed down some. It is still on track to affect you guys within the next 18 to 24 hours. Up across the western Atlantic, you can see an upper low has finally made its way off the United States coastline, off the northeast coastline, affecting parts of Maine, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia up in this general quadrant of the satellite image. And look at all this really good jet flow that's digging across the mid-Atlantic. You have jet stream or a polar front jet indicated by this channel darkening running across Minnesota and Wisconsin, through the Midwest, the lower Great Lakes, and then exiting somewhere near Virginia, West Virginia, and North Carolina. And the reason I bring this up is this is why we are very confident at this point, and it shows in Ernesto's slowing progress that the steering currents to its north are changing, and that turn towards the northwest and eventually due north is going to be coming very soon, which puts Bermuda and Atlantic Canada right in the crosshairs. Here's a closer look looking at our true color visible satellite transitioning over to our shortwave infrared overnight. Regardless, this is going to do a wonderful job of showing us just how much symmetry this system has gathered. If you look at the start of the loop, we had very pop-up, popcorn-like thunderstorms around the vortex in its immediate vicinity, which would basically insinuate that this system is still organizing, still steady to organize. But as I mentioned previously, diurnal maximum, the overnight maximum phase for these systems to really take advantage of that low-level instability confined predominantly within and around and beneath the cloud cover shrouding the core, the low-level circulation of this system, did wonders for this system. And now we're seeing a pretty good increase in symmetry. Our thunderstorms are finally starting to fire and consolidate closer to that center of circulation. We want to see this. If we want to anticipate and forecast continued development of a tropical cyclone, this is what it looks like. Remember yesterday in my live discussion, I'd mentioned we don't have any very strong hot towers, cumulonimbus storms that are really firing and pumping up the moisture amounts, pumping up the convection and that latent heat exchange right around that center of circulation. Well, now we do, and if I were to pause the satellite image and go right to the very tail end, notice how our cloud tops are very, very, very much so confined to where our low-level cyclone is likely present. We're not seeing it popping up in very sporadic spots around the center now. We are finally seeing it consolidate and move closer to that low-level cyclone, that mid-level cyclone, to increase its vertical stack and help to get this system to finally start deepening. And this slowing trend in its forward progress is going to help that as well. So for our Leeward Islands, you're going to see a continual increase in your overall sustained winds. Right now, we're still sitting around 40, 45 miles an hour. In your stronger thunderstorms, we are likely realizing winds in excess of 50 to 60 miles an hour. And then for the U.S. British Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico and everywhere in between, we will continue to see Ernesto take on strong stronger tropical characteristics, which is precisely what we were predicting. We figured that this would be a mid-grade tropical storm threat for our Puerto Rico viewers, the U.S. British Virgin Islands, and the Leeward Islands. Down in the southern half, the Windward Islands, particularly the last few that were primarily affected by Beryl when it came through: Barbados, Trinidad, Tobago, Grenada, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, St. Lucia, even Martinique to an extent. We are on the weaker side of the system. And I'll show you the streamlines. You're not completely out of the woods. You're definitely feeling the effects of a tropical storm, but just not nearly to the extent as your northern Leeward Island neighbors. Here's our current forecast track. And now, honestly, we haven't seen very much in the way of changes outside of the cone shrinking in confidence here at this point. We are finally coming into a fair bit of agreement that we will continue to move off towards the west-northwest at approximately 20 miles an hour. You can see we have come down pretty graciously. Yesterday morning when I saw you guys, we were moving at 26 miles an hour. Upon the upgrading of this system, taking on named storm status, it was moving at a whopping 28 miles an hour off towards the west. We finally dropped by about 8 miles an hour. This will fluctuate a little bit, but over the next 12 to 24 hours, this forward speed is going to come down more. If you guys have been watching this channel for a while, I always mention we want to watch the forward progress. If we start to see a slowing trend, that is a clear indicator for us forecasters and observers. The steering is probably changing and the storm is feeling that. So now that we're seeing it slow down, this is a clear indication that as we go over the rest of the day today and into tomorrow, it will start to gain some more latitude. And then Bermuda, we're right up next. After we get through the rest of our Leeward Islands, the U.S. British Virgin Islands, and Puerto Rico, Hispaniola, you're out of the cone, but we will likely feel lots of impacts and heavy rainfall, higher winds with this. If you saw how much the thunderstorm coverage is wrapping around the circulation and how expansive it is beginning to get, we're not out of the woods. Dominican Republic, predominantly, we are going to feel tropical storm-like characteristics. However, the wind field is fairly small on this system since it is still undergoing the early phases of its development, of its genesis, if you will. And that's more than likely why we don't have any tropical storm watches or warnings. WWA is in effect for that island. But regardless, you will realize some pretty heavy rainfall, elevated gusty winds within the bands wrapping around Ernesto. And then Bermuda, into this weekend, we're keeping a very close eye on you. And then beyond that, Atlantic Canada, particularly Newfoundland, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and maybe the eastern periphery of Quebec, depending on how much our long wave trough that's situated over the eastern U.S. can pull it back towards the west. You could feel some impacts from an extratropical Ernesto at that point. Here's a closer look at our interactive forecast cone. I like to pull this up so we can get a better handle of exactly what's going on out there. According to the National Hurricane Center, and I'll show you the streamlines on Windy and Zoom Earth here in a moment so you guys can get a better, more fluid look at it. The wind field for the tropical storm core here, the sustained winds, is tiny. Now, we have warnings issued across the board because we are on the dirty side of the system, that right front leading quadrant of our tropical storm. Even though we're not looking at a major hurricane here, that same principle applies. So if you extrapolate this forward and follow the system on its current course, kind of give it a little bit of that classic wobbling there as we draw our pink line, that wind field is going to grow some as it strengthens, but will translate off towards the west-northwest like so. Puerto Rico, you are still going to feel some effects from Tropical Storm Ernesto. Lots of heavy rainfall, flash flooding will likely be in effect. We're going to see some elevated winds between 50 to 65 miles an hour, maybe some interior gusts in your strongest convective bands, your most organized and most powerful thunderstorms around the center of circulation. But thankfully, we are forecasting you to be on the weaker side, especially since that forward momentum of the storm has slowed down dramatically in comparison to yesterday. It is a little more realistic now. This will start to gain some latitude and could possibly put you on the slightly weaker side of the system. And with a disorganized or organizing tropical storm, this does mean a lot. We're not looking at a perfectly symmetrical and rapidly intensifying hurricane. It's not going to be that perfect spherical structure we would see like we saw with Beryl, with a closed eye wall core of ring thunderstorms around that center. So it looks like a large majority of our Leeward Islands are realizing the effects of sustained tropical storm conditions. And if you go down further towards the south, everywhere from Guadeloupe, well, I should say Guadeloupe is encompassed by the tropical storm system, but further south from Guadeloupe, all the way through the rest of our Windward Islands, we are pretty much in the clear in terms of any heavy sustained winds. Clicking forward in time, you can see as we approach Puerto Rico, we are just off the eastern coastline of the island of Puerto Rico, having just made our way through the Virgin Islands. We are looking at a possible 60-mile-an-hour tropical storm at 2 a.m. tomorrow morning. So within another, we'll say, 18 hours, give or take, is when the worst of this system is going to be knocking knocking on your doorstep. The rest of the day today, your conditions are going to go downhill. Everybody is going to feel this storm throughout the day today, and then throughout tomorrow morning, before the sun comes up, your conditions will improve for my folks out there for, say, Guadeloupe, Antigua, Bermuda, Anguilla, St. Kitts and Nevis. You guys will see continual improvement in your conditions today. Maybe some residual thunderstorms wrapping into the backside of the system, but as we go into tonight, sunset, and into the very early morning hours of tomorrow, your conditions will go up, and then Puerto Rico, the British Virgin Islands, the U.S. Virgin Islands as well, and likely Dominican Republic, we'll see your conditions going downhill. It's going to be like a trough and ridge kind of setup. As the conditions improve for the Leeward Islands and the Lesser Antilles all together, Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Dominican Republic, your conditions are going to go down after sunset, particularly and through the early morning hours tomorrow until the sun comes up. You're going to be dealing with the worst that Ernesto has to offer. Now we're moving over to the windy overlay just so you guys can get a bit more of that fluid perspective, a feel for what the winds are doing in the atmosphere, not only where we can feel them, but above ground level. And if you look at the streamlines here, we are pretty well north side oriented. We're seeing a lot of easterly and northeasterly flow for the Lesser Antilles, the Leeward Islands particularly. The U.S. British Virgin Islands are likely seeing an increase in their surface winds, as is the northeast and east side of Puerto Rico, already feeling a bit of what are called pressure gradient winds around the center of Ernesto, also in association with the lowering pressures to the north and high pressure pummeling in off towards the northeast. You can see the winds coming off of the greater Atlantic, the subtropical Atlantic associated with our Atlantic high, our Azores high, that's helping to feed the pressure gradient force on the north side of this system. There's your center. It's sitting right over top the islands right now, getting ready to propagate over top, so the worst is in effect for some of you out there in the Lesser Antilles. Like I said yesterday, I'm not going to name specific islands because the northern half of the islands to the entirety here in my little pink box here are feeling the maximum influence of Tropical Storm Ernesto. Down towards the south, our Windward Island forecast from yesterday is verifying fairly well, it looks like. We do have heavy thunderstorms in effect right now. Temporarily, these are going to be sporadic and intermittent conditions, but if you look at the winds down here, they're all out of the south, feeding into the low-level inflow of our low-level circulation, our mid-level circulations. And that's what's helping to give a little bit more additional life force to the thunderstorm activity that's trying to continue to consolidate and organize before the sun comes up and we move into our diurnal minimum. As the surface of the earth and the surface of the water begins to heat around Ernesto, we're not going to have as much of that latent heat flux directly underneath where the center is. And as a result, our Windward Islands are doing fairly well right now. We do have a lot of heavy rainfall. It will likely cause some localized flooding, localized inundation, some river crossing flooding. Hopefully it doesn't produce any mudslides or landslides, given these are volcanic islands, but the heavier thunderstorms will come and go, unlike what's going on for the Leeward Islands. And as this continues to transition off towards the west and west-northwest, somewhere in this general fashion, you can see a lot of the winds are going to stay up to our north. So some of you, very few of you, will be in sustained conditions longer. Others may not feel very much at all. Here's just a second glance at another streamline tool. This is actually earth.com is what it's called. This is a more live look without the model data associated with it at the streamlines of our surface wind flow. There is your center somewhere in through here. It is not fully closed off. It is not 100% symmetrical, as I briefed you guys earlier. There's your strongest wind core right in through here, ripping around the northern apex of this system. It almost looks like a backwards ridge because we're not getting a lot of that westerly and that southwesterly flow, or I should say northwesterly flow on the back side of it that wraps up back into that low-level circulation. So right now our winds are probably in all sorts of different directions as you wander through those thunderstorms on the south side of the system for our windward nations all the way down to Trinidad and Tobago, the coastline of Venezuela and the Guianas associated with the thunderstorms with this system. And as this transitions west and eventually west-northwest, you can extrapolate this wind field out with it and draw it in more or less like so as this system continues to organize before finally shooting up into the southwest and western Atlantic. As we get ready to wrap up, here's a look at our super ensemble. So all of our ensemble models, the UK, the GFS, the Euro, and the Canadian, are in a fair bit of agreement. This system is going to begin that latitudinal pull towards the north, feeling the change in our steering currents induced by the long wave troughing over our eastern United States coast and the frontal boundary that's extending towards the western Atlantic, approaching Bermuda as we speak. We're even feeling it down here in our neck of the woods here in Florida. We're expecting a subtle decrease in our relative relative humidity and dew points over the next couple of days, which is a clear sign that troughing dry air advection is occurring over the eastern and southeastern United States, providing us with that protective blister and not allowing Ernesto to come any closer to the Turks and Caicos, the Bahamas, let alone the southeast United States. This is as we go through the 15th of August. Our system is likely to be to the north of our Greater Antilles out of the Caribbean. And then if you look, a large majority of our ensembles are really picking up in agreement that we are going to get pulled in by our long wave trough. And I'll draw it in for you guys as well. I'll kind of set the stage here. We have our Atlantic high spinning around out here in the central and eastern Atlantic, more in that Azores phase. There's your Azores Islands right there. It's more in that Azores phase being bullied off the western Atlantic or out of the western Atlantic by our trough axis that's extending down like so. And if you imagine this in a low pressure stance, with every trough, we have convergence behind it and we have divergence in front of it. So our low pressure area with the trough is going to be somewhere out in through here with a reinforcing shot of cool air coming across the Great Lakes to help reinforce the long wave axis right here. We have a short wave trough that's going to be moving in to help support keeping our long wave trough in the picture a little bit longer. Could possibly allow some height falls to occur behind it and bring it back to the west a little bit, which is why we need to be watching closely in Atlantic Canada. And now that I have the stage more or less drawn for you guys, I'll continue through these super ensembles, and you can see as we go forward in time, the ensembles are in a fair bit of agreement that Bermuda is going to be in the immediate crosshairs. Still a pretty decent swath in our individual members, but you can see the red, the black, the green, and the blue are ensemble means, our control members, if you will, indicating Bermuda is going to take a very close call from this system, and then an extremely close call to Atlantic Canada, with a large majority of our members still escaping just off the coastline, but there are still several keeping you under the threshold for potential direct impacts from what would be now a jet-supported non-tropical system. So even if it comes very close to your shoreline, you are going to feel what would technically be a Category 1, maybe borderline Category 2 hurricane, in this case with the jet stream pummeling into its center of circulation, pretty much like we saw with Lee last year going extratropical. We're going to take on a bit of a temperature gradient, a thermal wind as it's called, and that wind field that was once very located around, consolidated, tightened up around its circulation center is going to expand. So we need to be preparing for impacts and likely some sort of influence from Ernesto as it comes up, gets entrained in our jet stream and our trough axes here, and gets pulled into Atlantic Canada. But for all intents and purposes, it looks like the mainland U.S. are out of the woods for this one. And that, my friends, is going to wrap up this long-form, not live update here from the Weather Center. Thank you very much for tuning in. Thank you for taking some time out of your Tuesday morning to tune in for this. I have shot this a little earlier. This will likely be releasing at my usual time, around 8, 9 o'clock local time here in Central Florida, Eastern Daylight Time. So be on the lookout for that. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to drop them in the comments section down below. I will make it a point to get back to you. I always do. I have to make some adjustments to my schedule. I just recently had an hour's change, so I'll be starting at the time I would typically do my live updates. So now it likely will return to our live discussions being in the evening, more or less. I might try to squeak out some of this morning content for you guys on a recurring basis every other day, depending on what the weather activity looks like. But be prepared, we will likely continue to bolster our content towards the back end of the day as I work through the day, get some things done in the morning, and then we can focus on the weather as we go throughout the rest of the afternoon, early evening. So thank you all once again for being such a wonderful audience. I know we are not live, but regardless, for those of you all tuning in and watching this morning, hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, you guys are fantastic. You are the life and bloodline of this channel, of our community, and I graciously thank you for that and all of your continued support. We'll see you again very soon, but until then, this is Weather Center Nazario, signing out.